Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we interview Professor Corinna Mullin. She is a member of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. I go into a little bit of her bio in the episode as well, but please check out her full bio from the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective in the show description. In this discussion, we primarily focus on her piece, Zionism, Imperialism, and the Struggle Against Global Fascism, Palestine as the Hornet's Nest of U.S. Empire, from the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective blog, The Pen is My Machete. We also briefly discuss her piece, The War on Terror as Primitive Accumulation in Tunisia, U.S.-led Imperialism, and the post-2010-2011 revolt/security conjuncture from Middle East critique. In addition, we talk about some of the repression that she, other faculty, and students have faced at CUNY. As we discuss in the episode, Dr. Mullin was fired from CUNY as a result of her stance and organizing with respect to Palestine. We include a statement from the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, as well as a statement in solidarity with CUNY faculty and students facing McCarthyite retaliation for Palestine solidarity, which we have signed, and we encourage others to do so as well. There are also a number of other calls to action for faculty and students at CUNY that we included in the show description. Karina talks about those at the end of the episode, and we strongly encourage folks to listen to that part of the discussion, and of course to sign on to those letters of support and petitions, which only will take a minute of your time. In this discussion, Dr. Mullin also talks a little bit about Dr. Ali Qadri's book, The Accumulation of Waste, A Political Economy of Systemic Destruction. And it just so happens that we have a study group on that exact book starting on October 1st. It's available to everyone who supports the show, whether through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or as a YouTube member of the show. Details on that study group and how to join it are linked in the show description. But just to note that there are only about 40 spaces left in the group as we publish, so if you want to join us, make sure to sign up ASAP to reserve your space. And as always, if you like what we do and appreciate this work, please consider becoming a patron of the show. You can do so for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. We also have a Buy Me a Coffee page where folks can do recurring or one-time contributions to our work. It is only the support of regular, everyday listeners like you that make this show possible. And we thank all of you for supporting the show. Now, here's our conversation with Dr. Corinna Mullin. Today, really excited for the interview that we're going to do with Karina Mullen. Karina is an anti-imperialist academic who teaches political science and economics. Her research examines the historical legacies of colonialism and the role of capitalist expansion and imperialist imbrications in producing peripheral state security dependency, with the focus on unequal exchange, super-exploitation, resource extraction, and other forms of surplus value, drain, and transfer, as well as resistance. There's a lot more to the bio, which I'm going to link in the show description. This bio also, I should say, I'm excited to say, is from the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, which we'll talk a little bit about today. I think probably a lot of people who listen to this podcast are familiar with this recently formed group, which includes a number of scholars that we've had on the platform over the years, but also some that we have not yet that we hope to. And, I intend to, and I'm sure Josh will as well, be doing some more collaborations with them. They have a blog/journal that puts out a issue every month right now, and they just put out their second issue, Black August. And we're going to talk to Karina about a piece that she wrote in the first issue today, as well as a little bit of her other work. And I do want to say just up front, too, that Karina has faced significant repression as a result of her solidarity with Palestinians amid Zionist imperialist genocide. And she also obviously was a teacher at CUNY, and I'm sure we'll also have something to say, too, about students who have faced repression there as well. And it's, one of the more significant, I think, there's a lot of repression that's been related to the student intifada in the United States, and with responses of educators to the genocide. But, the cases at CUNY don't get as much media attention as, ones at, say, Columbia or something like that, and so I look forward to, being able to talk with her a little bit about that. And I do want to just say, there's a statement of solidarity, which we have signed. I've signed personally and on behalf of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, that we will include in the show description and encourage other folks to do so as well. And, from my perspective, this is one of those things where on one level, it's sort of a badge of honor, that they consider Karina's scholarship to be enough of a threat, and her relationship to her students to be enough of a threat to go after her in this way. But obviously, on the flip side of that, it certainly shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be allowed to happen. And it should entice us all to try to stand in solidarity as much as we can, not just with Karina, but with other scholars who are in similar circumstances, and other students and grad students, and just other people who are trying to resist this genocide and support Palestinian liberation, wherever they are. And so I will share that in the show description and encourage people to join us in signing that statement. And so without further ado, Karina, it's great to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Jared. Yeah, it's really great to be with you. And I'm just such a huge fan of your work. You just do such a great job of bringing on amazing guerrilla intellectuals and, Walter Rodney's terms, and incredible organizers. And I've learned so much over the years from your work.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I mean, I'm a longtime kind of fan, admirer of your work too. And you work with a lot of the folks that we have a lot of kind of mutual friends and comrades and stuff like that. And so I'm very excited to kind of talk to you about some of your scholarship, and as well as, how you engage as a scholar in empire. And, I'm really excited about the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective and the work that you all are doing, and kind of naming your politics and working from that perspective. And I think that that's very admirable, knowing that, you know, our government and our institutions really don't want us to do that, right? They really want us to kind of, figure out some way to soften it on the edges and be more compatible, I guess, with the imperial project. And so it's appreciated that you all are taking that kind of what I think is a bold intellectual stance.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, exactly as you point out, it's really, especially at this moment of imperialist counterinsurgency and the role of the university in that, the battle of ideas is really crucial and central. And there's so much political confusion out there right now. And even, and maybe especially among people who identify as being on the left. So it's really, really crucial at this moment, I think, to have this group of incredible, scholars, organizers who are doing this kind of intellectual work, really committed to challenging US imperialism, supporting unapologetically national liberation across, the global majority, and through, critical knowledge production and international solidarity. So I feel so honored to be amongst such an incredible group of scholars, of guerrilla intellectuals, and constantly learning from them, and the networks that we're, all a part of, and you're a part of.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, and absolutely agree. I mean, it is a great network of people, and you can see the way that the piece that we're going to talk about today. You're citing a lot of people that are within this network, or kind of close to the network, or friends with people in the network, or comrades, and so on. And there's just a lot of really vital intellectual work that's going on there. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of CUNY system, and you know its role, also in supporting this genocide. We've heard a great deal about, kind of Columbia and, the UCLAs, right? These kind of big flashpoints at these very elite and very wealthy endowed universities, right? And their role, in suppressing the student intifada. But, stories from places like CUNY, places also like the CSU system in California, where you have these kind of, there are universities that are more working class often, but also have really rich histories of, connections to student movements in the late 60s and the whole ethnic studies movements, right? And the kind of third world liberationist sort of struggles that infused themselves into student movements, which were the battles to get, things like Black studies and so on, that there are rich histories in these places. And this is also I mean, this is true at all universities. I feel like that there's kind of a branding that goes on after the fact of like, they were all fighting against these movements in those time periods, but they like to say, oh, we're part of the anti-apartheid struggle here at, where was I? I was at UC Santa Barbara last year, and they had, there was a Bank of America that had been burned down and turned into like a campus building, and they had all this memorialization of it, right? But at the same time, there's a student encampments going on, and there's an antagonistic relationship, of course, between the administrations and these student movements. And so, these contradictions are kind of everywhere, as is this sort of the branding that comes much later. But in a moment right now, you can see really all of the kind of repression that has gone on against these really beautiful expressions, I think, of solidarity that have sprung up on campuses across our country. And so I just wanted to give you space to talk a little bit about that within the context of CUNY.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's really been pretty incredible to watch these last 2 years, as you've pointed out, the incredible mobilization that we've seen across college campuses, really identifying and heightening, the contradictions of the colonial capitalist university as it exists in the belly of the beast. The students have been amazing making these connections between the role of their institutions and their investments in the military-industrial complex and imperialist warfare and settler colonialism, also connecting up to the militarization of their campuses, the role of police on campuses, the role of institutions in, colonial ethnic cleansing, gentrification of the communities in which universities are embedded. So really, making those material connections between their universities and empire, and U.S. imperialism and the colonial capitalist state here. And I think at CUNY, you're right, a lot of the sort of working class institutions have been left out of some of the kind of, more mainstream narratives of how October 7th, the Al-Aqsa flood and the genocide that followed and students' response to that, both, in demonstrating solidarity with Palestinian national liberation, and in resisting the genocide, how that has unfolded across our campuses and universities, institutions like CUNY often are left out of those narratives, for multiple reasons. I mean, in large part because, these are working class, largely Black and brown institutions. CUNY has around 250,000 students, 25 campuses. It's the largest urban public university in the country. A majority of students, are from working class backgrounds. I think something like 50% of our students are food insecure, which, is horrific in and of itself. But also, I think CUNY, there are a handful of other examples that also come to mind, I think was really one of the more radical campuses as well in terms of the kinds of demands that have been articulated in the context of the encampment of the Gaza Solidarity Encampment in 2024 and that continue to be made today. There were 5 demands that came out of the Gaza Solidarity Encampment at CUNY, many of them similar to other campuses, in particular, BDS, for example, which is, really the most central one because it really gets to the heart of that contradiction I was talking about earlier and, really talking about the material, how we can materially transform our universities, materially decolonize. There's so much discussion and it's been, very well critiqued of some of the sort of decolonial approaches to the university. But, the BDS, at least especially the way it's been taken up in recent years by students, is really getting to the heart of, the material dimensions of the colonial capitalist university. But also, CUNY students, consistently demonstrated their solidarity with Palestinian resistance and, saw that as, not only seeing Palestinians as victims, of course, the genocide is horrific, hundreds of thousands of people, killed. And, you've talked about it so much on your program. So, I know you and all of your viewers and listeners are familiar with it, the complete destruction of Gaza, all universities destroyed, agricultural land, complete families wiped off the face of the earth. The death and destruction has just been relentless. But beyond that, it's also crucial. And, as so many amazing scholars and organizers have taught us in recent years, and of course, going back really to the beginning of settler colonialism in Palestine, is that, Palestinians have to also be seen as agents of their own national liberation. And October 7th really reinforced that. And CUNY as a space, and with a history, and we can talk a little bit about that too, of sort of radical organizing, it sort of just made sense to students and many workers at CUNY to also focus on that and demand solidarity with Palestinian liberation. So I think that's also a reason that oftentimes CUNY has been sort of left out of some of the more mainstream narratives of the encampment. But also, you mentioned the history of CUNY and, as a sort of thinking about it as, a terrain of struggle, both repression and resistance. And in my, case, especially, and I can talk a little bit about that more as well, of my firing and alongside the firing of 3 other adjuncts at CUNY. And we're, not the first, there were also 2 adjuncts who were fired last year, Palestine Solidarity as well. And, but especially now because of the mass firings and the fact that the chancellor has essentially, the chancellor of CUNY essentially admitted in front of a McCarthyite congressional hearing in July that these were political firings. He accepted the premise of this McCarthyite hearing, falsely equating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. He basically threw faculty, including myself, who was named by Randy Fine, one of these fascist Congress members who thinks that Gaza should be nuked. And, the chancellor sort of admitted, said that, yes, this is an acceptable, framework. And there was a political purge. He accepted that. And that's what our union, the PSC CUNY, is describing this as a political purge and using the language of McCarthyism. And, I think that really reminds us of the history of struggle and repression at CUNY. Back in the 40s, we had a lot of communist, or left sympathetic faculty members who were fired after the Rapkuder report in the 1940s. There was a wave of McCarthyite repression at CUNY and across the city. There was also, of course, in the 60s, CUNY, as you were referencing the struggles for ethnic studies. Brooklyn College, where one of the colleges I was fired from as an adjunct, I teach at 2 colleges at CUNY, Brooklyn College and John Jay. Brooklyn College in 1969, there was a deoccupation. They actually took over, I think, the president's office. I mean, imagine that happening today for 12 days. And it was students and faculty and staff. And they, were demanding Black and Puerto Rican studies and open admissions. And something similar happened at CCNY in 1969 as well. And, these were heavily repressed at the time. I know at Brooklyn College, many of the students faced felony charges. I think only dropped because Shirley Chisholm had intervened on behalf of the students and faculty. So yeah, there's this long history of struggle at CUNY. And, Palestine solidarity has, especially in the last 2 decades, has really featured prominently in that struggle. There's always been a struggle, again, a working class, Black and brown institution, many people coming from countries that have been destroyed by U.S. imperialism. So anti-imperialism has always been central to that organizing, anti-colonialism, because many people are victims of colonialism or their parents or their grandparents, and, including in this country, it's settler colonialism, and of course, legacies of slavery, capitalist racism, police violence. So all of those abolition, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism have always been central to CUNY organizing. And especially in the 2000s, Palestine came to be more central to the anti-imperialist organizing at CUNY. And in 2016, the graduate students passed a resolution calling for BDS at CUNY. There was also in 2021, I believe, a CUNY law students passed a resolution calling for BDS as well. Even the union, PSC CUNY, passed a resolution, and not a BDS one, but in solidarity with Palestinians. And this was following the massacres that took place in Gaza and also in the West Bank, or in East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, in 2021. So that led to really a consolidation of organizing in solidarity with Palestine. And we have, of course, many Palestinian students, as well as faculty members and staff, as well as many Muslim and Arab students as well. Of course, and also many Jewish students, and other students who participate in this kind of organizing. But it's really has been central for many years. And CUNY for Palestine, the organization that I organized with, emerged out of this in 2016 to work together, bring students, faculty, and staff together to fight for BDS, to defend students, especially facing repression, as well as faculty and staff, and to also build coalition, to make connections between Palestine as an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle with the struggle against what Charisse Burden-Stelly refers to as capitalist racism here in the belly of the beast.
Awesome. Thank you for that breakdown. And, you brought up Charisse Burden-Stelly, and you also said something that made me think. We had a conversation with her several months ago now. And in that conversation, we were talking about her book, Black Scare, Red Scare. And she talked about how in the context of today that she thinks that the war on anti-Semitism is essential, that anti-Semitism is the new communism, right? And so meaning that the way that anti-Semitism operates within this kind of war on anti-Semitism, that this is the way that communism operated within McCarthyism and the Red Scare, right? And so that by branding someone anti-Semitic or branding something as anti-Semitism, you kind of create this sort of category through which you can basically do anything to them and it becomes acceptable within society, a sort of special category of repression. And when she said that, I thought it was a really, it made a lot of sense to me. And I hadn't kind of made that direct connection. And of course, it's a great historical irony as well, because of, for many years that it was often Jewish people who were branded as communists, right? And the whole idea of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies and all of this kind of stuff was very prominent, in that era, the first kind of phases of Red Scare and McCarthyism too. But nonetheless, here we are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think there are people who were part of the movements, from that period. Like, for example, my grandparents were part of the Communist Party in that period and Jewish. And my family, I come from an anti-Zionist family, but there are, of course, people who were repressed in that period and don't see the parallels. Although I think increasingly, at least and there is a sort of a broader swath. I just, have heard, for example, Ellen Schrecker, who is a scholar of McCarthyism. She spoke in an event we organized at CUNY around resurgent McCarthyism, and she certainly sees those parallels. And I think more and more people are seeing those parallels. And yeah, Charisse Burden-Stelly's work is just so crucial in helping to understand how Zionism is forming a sort of similar ideological role as anti-communism. Yeah, the irony, I guess, that you're pointing out is that many, Jewish people were part of that first wave of McCarthyism, and yet today struggling to see how anti-Semitism is being mobilized in a similar way. It's just mind-blowing how distorted this discourse is, and that anti-Semitism is really, is performing this role of enabling fascist repression here and imperialist interventions of all sorts abroad. So yeah, it's a really bizarre and worrying time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should clarify for folks, I don't mean actual anti-Semitism. I just mean the way that this is mobilized as an assault on anti-Zionism and as which there, as you've pointed out, there are many anti-Zionist Jewish people who are attacked and called anti-Semitic through this kind of framework. So it's, yeah, absolutely. Was there anything else? I know that we did talk a little bit about Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective in the opening. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about this group?
I really hope folks will check out the website. We have this amazing website, a great blog, as you pointed out. The pen is my machete, and that's anti-imperialist.com. Yes, so if you see, the pen is my machete, we're on volume 2, as you pointed out, Black August. We have some really, really great pieces there, including by Charisse Burden-Stelly, Red Scare Tactics and the Criminalization of Radical Fightback, which, really is just so relevant to everything we're talking about. A great piece by Jackie Lookman, also on the military occupation of Washington, D.C. Musa Springer has a piece connecting the dots between anti-imperialist struggle, Black August, and Cuban liberation. And then we also have some great poetry by Tongo Aysen Martin, and 2 great pieces by 2 leading anti-imperialist scholars today, Wala El-Qaisiya on queer feminism and genocide, and Matteo Capasso, the role of the anti-imperialist intellectual. Also, Louis Alday, a great piece on Iran, Zionism, and the defeat of the imperialist narrative. So really hope everyone will check it out. Our first issue was also great, and I'm just so excited. I mean, I'm learning so much from everything I've read, and I'm so excited for future editions. I think we're having one coming up on Russia, a roundtable on Russia, which should be really exciting. And I also urge folks to look at the principles of unity, because that in and of itself is a form of political education. And I think really great sort of guidelines for how to be an anti-imperialist scholar. And I'll just list the 5. I won't get into it unless you want to talk about them. The principles of unity. One is, and this also is sort of the premise for my own piece that I published last month in the blog, which is US-led imperialism is the primary contradiction in the world system. Secondly, we support national liberation, anti-imperialist internationalism, and revolutionary socialism. Third, we must liberate international institutions from the clutches of imperialism. Fourth, we emphasize a dialectical and historical materialist approach to our scholarship that is committed to the liberation of oppressed peoples. And I think that's really important, because a lot of sort of Western Marxists adopt sort of Marxist principles, but not Marxist methodology. And that could lead to all kinds of sort of confused thinking. Fifth, we employ critical pedagogy and analysis with our students to foster a liberated world. As so many of us are educators, and really committed to nurturing a comprehensive, critical, and truthful analysis of the world our students inhabit. So that's a really important dimension as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And those are great principles of unity. I co-sign all of them. So excellent. So we'll come back to this in a little bit, because we're going to get to the piece that you wrote for the first issue. But I wanted to also just bring up, you're also an associate editor at Middle East Critique, which, you mentioned Matteo Capasso does great work with them as well. We also try to always, at Millennials, retweet whenever you all have a new issue out, which I think there's a new issue out today, right? I think I just saw one come out this morning. So folks, please go check that out. Maybe we should pause there and say a little bit about that issue, actually.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's a great issue. There's, I think, 3 really crucial, important pieces on the political and ideological legacy of Saeed Hassan Nasrallah and its leadership of Hezbollah, both in Lebanon and regionally. Some really, really great pieces in there. I urge people to read that and just, browse through past issues as well. Middle East Critique, like AISC, is just such a vital platform for anti-imperialist scholars, challenging, imperialist domination, centered on liberation, supporting national liberation. Again, it's analysis you wouldn't get in other academic spaces, even left academic spaces. It's so crucial, the knowledge production that Middle East Critique is dedicated to. And there's also, I really urge everyone to read the editorial by Matteo Capasso on critiquing Euro-American Middle East studies as a sort of integrated system of imperialist knowledge production. It's just, again, provides like a really helpful framework of analysis, not just for how anti-imperialist scholars should approach Middle East studies, but the academy more generally. And thinking about, questions of political economy, donors, the concepts and theories that we use, and really challenging the sort of cognitive warfare, we can say, of the academy, which is just constantly, it needs to be challenged all the time. And I think the repetition, I'm thinking of an interview you did recently with Lara Sheehy, where she was saying, thinking about, when you guys were talking about, what is it, the lizard brain, and and how it's sort of imperialism, functions by like really trying to impact the most underdeveloped parts of our brain and the affective dimensions. And repetition is really crucial to that. It also made me think of Edward Said's work in intertextuality, which he talks about in Orientalism, and how imperialist knowledge production, really that's one of the ways it functions is through the self-referencing and repetition. And so it's so crucial for anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist scholars to do the same thing, and that you mentioned earlier, the citational practice in my work, and you'll see it in all of these scholars in these critical anti-imperialist spaces. It's also a political praxis of citation in order to uplift and center, not just because they're brilliant and it's the correct analysis, but also because these are voices that are marginalized and that you won't get in the syllabi of most college courses, and you won't see them referenced in most peer-reviewed academic publications. And so it's so crucial for those of us who subscribe to an anti-imperialist analysis to constantly uplift and center and do the same sort of, repeat, and the same sort of a kind of counter-hegemonic intertextuality. And that's, really what these spaces are doing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more that I would shout out also is Agrarian South Journal is just another one. Like all three of these publications, like if folks are looking for stuff that's just really rigorous and, well done scholarship, but also, grounded in like really key anti-imperialist principles. And as you said, the real importance of national liberation, and understanding that, as well as you said, the point of understanding imperialism in this, period of time, that it is a system that is a US led system, and so it doesn't mean that there aren't other harms or oppressions or things like that in the world that are not the cause of US imperialism. It just means that this is sort of the primary structuring antagonism of the world system, and that it is, where we have to focus a lot of our analysis to really change the world for the better and to allow for fuller expressions of humanity. So,
yeah, and I would just say, if I can also plug as well, I also am an associate editor of Science and Society, which is the oldest Marxist English language journal in the country. And it's a bit more ecumenical in its approach. But, you certainly find, and there was recently a special issue on the Cuban Revolution, for example, there's also increasingly more material on questions of, global majority, national liberation. And it's a really solid Marxist journal as well. So also would urge folks to look there too.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. All right. So one of the pieces that you wrote for Middle East Critique that I looked at is this piece called The War on Terror as Primitive Accumulation in Tunisia, US-led Imperialism, and the post-2010-2011 Revolt/Security Conjuncture. And in it, you talk about how, quote, the violence of the War on Terror has laid, quote, the groundwork for a new wave of primitive accumulation. And so could you just talk a little bit about this relationship in the context of Tunisia in the period you've analyzed? I know that Tunisia is one of the areas that you've done quite a bit in studying. So,
yeah, sure. So, I guess I start by sort of situating the analysis for this piece in relation to Ali Qadri's work on accumulation of waste. And I think it's a really important theoretical contribution that Kadri makes to our understanding of imperialism and capitalist imperialist wars and militarization, and really influenced my thinking, as well as a piece that he wrote together with Matteo Capasso, which was the introduction, in fact, to the special issue of Middle East Critique that this piece was for. And, just to say that, Kadri explains that capitalism as, political economy is not just about producing commodities, but also waste. And as he talks about, the waste of nature, the waste of human beings, including through premature death. So not just the physical killing of people, but ensuring that their lives end early. And that, and I'll just in parentheses here point out, shares a lot in common with, another a piece that's very influential in my thinking, and especially for another piece I wrote on the political economy of the genocide in Gaza, of the Zionist imperialist genocide, which is the 1951 We Charge Genocide petition that, was connected to the Communist Party and, many sort of Black radical luminaries who were part of producing that petition, including Paul Robeson, who actually delivered it, and William Patterson, and many others who worked on that document. And, it meticulously demonstrated the history of genocide against Black people in particular, and also indigenous people in the U.S. through centuries of slavery and also the afterlives of slavery and Jim Crow and racist police violence and vigilante white violence. And, really highlights the political economy of it, the monopoly capital, the corporations that benefited from genocide and from the shortened, not just from the killing of Black people, but of course of exploitation of labor and the shortening lifespans, dispossession of land, and labor, and thinking about that systematically. And, Kadri's work does something similar on a world scale, thinking about how the imperialist wars create these, conditions through which labor exploitation is easier. The drain of natural resources is easier. Also reducing the social wage for the state because, if people die earlier, the state doesn't have to invest in things like welfare, social security, housing, healthcare. And also, of course, it creates ecological collapse as well. So thinking about all of the various ways that the imperialist system and capitalist system profits from death and destruction, many people talk about the military-industrial complex, and of course that plays an incredibly important role as a sort of driver of capital accumulation in the world system today. But it's also more than that. If we want to understand unequal exchange of labor and trade, in terms of compressing the wages of global South workers, we also have to understand the role of imperialist war in doing that and creating the vulnerabilities and precarity that result in super-exploitation of global South workforce. So Kadri's work for me has been really crucial in doing that. And this concept of structural genocide that he develops, which I talk about more in the AISC piece, but also is relevant for the piece I wrote on primitive accumulation, the war on terror in Tunisia. And he draws there on Lenin to talk about structural genocide. And, we can also think about it as a form of structural racism, too, that going back to, again, the We Charge Genocide document, how structural racism impacts unequal wages, unemployment, overall wealth, access to healthcare, nutrition, housing. All of that is shaped by the structures of colonial capitalism, imperialism. So that's the sort of context, that's the sort of theoretical framework that I had. And also thinking about, in the specific context of a country like Tunisia, a peripheral capitalist state that has, since its independence in 1956, been more or less aligned to the West. So, a distinct history from other West Asian and North African states. For example, its neighbor Algeria or Libya, which had antagonistic relations and, more antagonistic relations with the imperialist core. But in the case of Tunisia, it's not so much as a military intervention. It's not an imperialist war in the sense that you had in Libya in 2011, with the U.S.-led NATO intervention and regime change, against Gaddafi. But in Tunisia, it's taken the form more of militarization. So thinking about how the war on terror, like the war on drugs, and I know you've covered a lot of that in many of your interviews as well, is a sort of ideological framework to justify various forms of intervention. And it's not always, a direct military intervention. It's, could be in the form of training the military, for example, providing the weapons for the military. So those weapon systems are controlled and surveillance systems are controlled by U.S. military industrial complex. And so, it could be also training the police, the prisons, which is the case in Tunisia as well. And all of that is done in a way to ideologically infuse those institutions with, the same strategic aims and anxieties of, Western imperialism, and, becomes clear in the context of the war on terror in terms of like who is determined and, defined as an enemy, for example. So there's that dimension as well as the material dimension, and how the systems that are put in place, the types of policing, the types of militarization, the surveillance are all implemented in a way that contributes to this accumulation of waste, that reduces the lifespan of the working class, that makes people, that compresses the wages of the working class, that results in proletarianization of peasants, for example, so that they're removed from the land. And that land then can be used for capitalist forms of development and, natural resource extraction. So all of this, in the context of the war on terror that predates, the focus of this piece is on the 2010 to 2011 conjuncture following the uprising in Tunisia. But the war on terror predates that, of course, because Tunisia under Ben Ali was the first country in the region to declare his support for Bush's, so-called war on terror. But what's interesting to me and why I look at this particular conjuncture is that this was a moment of potential for liberation. There are lots of contradictions in that movement that could be discussed, but there was a lot of liberatory potential in that moment. But how does it then get harnessed and used in a way to reinforce unequal relations between Tunisia and the capitalist imperialist core, and specifically the US, not only to reinforce, but even to extend these relations of dependency? And I look at specifically through the lens of security dependency, which is, the dependency of the military, the police, the security apparatuses on the imperialist core. And without security independence, without, and we see this, I'm still in awe and shock of what I saw yesterday, China's, the military parade they did that was, carried out there and yesterday. And just to see the sort of incredible equipment, the discipline, really awe-inspiring, that what was being demonstrated through that parade was China's security independence, right? That a state can't be independent if it doesn't have an independent military. And the productive capacity of China's military today is incredible. It surpasses it surpasses the US and the imperialist core. And, of course, I would prefer a world where we could invest, our surplus in life-sustaining and life-affirming institutions and not the military. Not just, thinking about the capital that's invested, but of course the labor, the energy, the thinking, the brilliant minds. But this is the reality we live in today. We live in a system that's dominated by the death cult, known as the United States, and driven by, capital accumulation. And so therefore, a key feature of imperialism today is to keep the militaries of global majority states dependent upon the weapons systems, the technologies and the political and economic control of the West, of the US in particular. So, yeah, that piece for me was really about trying to understand the role of militarism in the more subtle form, not in the direct military intervention form, on a peripheral state, capitalist state like Tunisia, and how that undermines the possibilities for really, working class peasant liberation, because essentially the state is structured to repress any forms of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist dissent, and to ensure that labor in the country is still, compliant and natural resources are still extractable. And so that unequal exchange and polarized accumulation on a world scale can continue as it has for centuries.
Yeah, no, thank you for all of that breakdown. Really appreciate it. So I want to move into the other piece that I want to talk to you about today, which is one you wrote for The Pen is My Machete, which again is the blog from the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. You can find it at anti-imperialists.com. So the piece is entitled Zionism, Imperialism, and the Struggle Against Global Fascism, Palestine as the Hornet's Nest of U.S. Empire. So before moving into some of the specifics, could you just talk a little bit about the general argument you're making here in this piece, that Palestine is the hornet's nest of U.S. empire, and how we should think about the relationship between Zionism, imperialism, and the struggle against global fascism in this conjuncture?
Yeah, so essentially, this piece was my attempt to sort of think through, we talked about earlier the role of the campus movement, the student intifada, and how important it was for students in particular to make these connections, the material connections between Zionism, the role of their institutions materially in supporting settler colonialism in Palestine and imperialist warfare, and then the repression that they have faced as a result of making these connections. And of course, anyone in solidarity with them, and I include myself because I think my firing in large part is connected to, the sort of criminalization of student worker solidarity, which is a real threat to institutions because combined, those forces are unstoppable. So, this piece that's where it emerged out of, was my sort of thinking through and attempting to theorize these connections. And, and I also was extremely influenced and shaped by one of the pieces I reference is the Louis Alday and Es Sala piece, where they also, they talk about the historical also dimensions of that connection between fascism and Zionism. And, essentially how there's always been a relationship between these forces from the establishment of the settler colonial state in 1948, but even prior to its establishment for decades under the British colonial mandate. So, I think the way that I sort of think about it in this piece is that Zionism is the sort of ideological superstructure of fascism today. It's one of the most prominent expressions of international fascism. So there's, again, the ideological component, the discursive component, and how, things get discussed and represented in mainstream narratives. And then there's also, on the other hand, the material dimensions of this. So the role that the Zionist entity plays, not only in the settler colonial genocide and the dispossession of the Palestinian people, the role that it plays in the military-industrial complex and the integration between the Zionist entities, military-industrial complex, and the U.S., especially, in drone warfare and surveillance technology. And people like, Max Eil, for example, have talked about this extensively. But also, the role, as also Eil and Alex Aviña, for example, have talked about, the role of the Zionist entity in propping up fascist, anti-communist, if we go back to the, dirty wars and 60s and 70s and 80s across Latin America, trying to undermine communist movements, socialist states, national liberations movements across Latin America, Africa, Asia. So, the role that they played in supporting counterinsurgency, Contras, death squads, training them, providing weapons to them, doing it in a way as the sort of the U.S.'s mercenary force and providing plausible deniability to the U.S. in carrying out many covert actions to undermine all forms of socialist, nationalist, any form of global majority, national liberation. And so, historically, that's been the case. And even if we go back to, and I think now people are really starting to make these connections, but it's not new, of course. I mean, Palestinians have been making this connection from day one, There's also, if we go back to the Organization of African Union in 1975, I cited the resolution in which Zionism was defined as racism and colonialism and compared to imperialism, apartheid, and colonialism on the African continent. And so, that's how that's this kind of theoretical framework that I use here to analyze the contemporary conjuncture, where we see, again, the primary contradiction of U.S. imperialism at a moment of the rise of a multipolar world order, which is challenging U.S. imperialism. And so fascism, as I describe it in this piece as well, is a way to sort of stabilize capitalist accumulation in this moment of imperialist crisis. And Zionism is the ideological sort of infrastructure, framework through which it is, that stabilization and the violence that it entails. Because let's, be clear, this is a violent, I'm talking about it in sort of abstract theoretical terms. But what does it mean to stabilize capital accumulation at the time of imperialist crisis? It means genocide. That's what it means. It means, blowing up entire families, children being torn from their mothers' bellies, the destruction of all of nature. That's what it means. And, as many people have pointed out, I think Gustav Petro, put it early on, is that, this is the genocide that awaits all this world's surplus populations. And so, in that sense, to understand the current conjuncture of imperialist crisis and how the ruling class in the capitalist core is attempting to stabilize requires understanding Zionism, its history, its material and ideological function in stabilizing polarized accumulation on a world scale.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to talk about Ukraine, and you work this into this piece, and it's just something. I think this is a failure of analysis of a lot of folks on the kind of left, and it's weird. I mean, like, just anecdotally, I've talked about this with folks, but YouTube has way more restrictions on what we can say about Ukraine than they do about what we can say about Palestine. And I think that that's really interesting. There's all this language about like not repeating Russian propaganda and stuff like that associated with the war, and that you can't say, so it's like it very much, even if it's just through self-censorship, it causes, I think, a lot of people not to engage, but others have. But it's just an interesting thing that just a general across the kind of, even among anti-imperialists, left-wing media outlets, and, this is self-criticism here as well, that we just have not covered this war very, very well at all, or in many cases kind of just ignored it, as huge of a conflict as it has been, and as devastating it has been, obviously, to the people who have been, killed and displaced and all of that, and as a part of it. But it's obviously very important geopolitically, like critically so. And it's important to the projects, quite obviously, of US NATO imperialism as well. And it's important in terms of the kind of developing shift away also from a unipolar imperialist world. And so I would just love for you to just talk a little bit about the key aspects of the importance of this war for US-led imperialism and the world system, and how you're kind of thinking through that in this piece.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you pointed out how it almost feels more difficult to speak about Ukraine than Palestine in this context. Something else that I've noticed is that a lot of people have made the point that, and this was especially early on in the genocide, why is it that people support and applaud sending weapons to Ukraine, but not to the Palestinians, for example, the Ukrainians to so-called, right?
Yeah, I just want to say one clarification too to what I said. Part of it is because there was such a broad liberal support for U.S. support of Ukraine. I wouldn't even, not calling it support for Ukraine is actually a misnomer, but for U.S. support of NATO and this war, which is taking place in Ukraine, right? But so yeah, I mean, in some level, I think part of this is that there is actually a pretty sophisticated censorship regime around this, but also that there was so much liberal, to me, very vacuous and fake solidarity too, that just instantly, kind of sprung up, and was in all of our media and everything else for a long time. It's kind of gone away now, but there's still a lot of Ukrainian flags in my neighborhood and stuff like that, and yet on the flip side, yes, absolutely what you were about to say with Palestine. But yeah, I did want to make that clarification because it's not as though it's actually quite easy to say I support Ukraine, but that's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having an analysis of what this war means from a kind of anti-imperialist and world system perspective.
Right. Totally. Totally. No. I get where you were going with that question. I wanted to make that point and that connection because I think it highlights the role of Ukraine and this war from a world system perspective, in the sense that when people make that point and look at this as, as a sign of hypocrisy or double standards, I'm always like, no, it's actually not. It's actually the same thing, right? The fact that the U.S. supports neo-Nazis in Ukraine as part of its proxy war against Russia and NATO expansion in Eurasia is very much connected to the imperialist Zionist genocide in Gaza. The aims are the same, going back to what we were discussing earlier, which is about stabilizing polarized accumulation on a world scale in the face of imperialist capitalist crisis, right? And so the two are actually very connected in that sense. And, really, I think to understand, and, there are loads more people who can talk about this better than I can, but obviously to understand the roots of the current crisis today, in the US-NATO war against Russia, we have to begin in 2014. Obviously we can go much further back, but as with October 7th, these are dates that sort of get highlighted and reified as a way, and this is another dimension of information warfare, or cognitive warfare, or the ideological superstructure of imperialism, which is, to look at, firstly, like discrete sites of imperialist intervention as discrete sites, not to make connections between them, and then also to isolate dates from their broader histories in order, to isolate sort of events and conjunctures from their broader histories in order to not see the connections, the systemic and structural connections. So 2014 is when you had this far-right coup in Ukraine that was obviously backed or orchestrated by Washington, by the US and European powers. It overthrew the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, and, was presented, as a kind of democratic uprising, one of these color revolutions, but actually, was a culmination of a longstanding US strategy to install compliant regimes on Russia's borders. And so fast forward to 2022, Washington deliberately provoked Russia, I think, into invading Ukraine through the expansion or the threatened expansion of NATO and placing missiles within striking distance of Moscow. So the war was backed for these geostrategic reasons. And the idea was to weaken Russia and ultimately, also break off Russia from China, the ultimate aim being, sort of backdoor to China as well, and creating disunity on the Euro-Asian continent in order to block the rise of a multipolar world order, China's rise and the rise of a multipolar world order. So sanctions were, of course, a really important part of that. Here, the idea was, and, I was also part of the International Peoples Tribunal on U.S. imperialism, sanctions, and a unilateral course of economic measures. And one of the aims of the tribunal was to really point out how sanctions serve as a crucial tool of U.S. imperialism today, and one of the ways through which colonial forms of wealth drain from the global majority and their transfer to the capitalist imperialist core is secured today through a form of economic warfare that is designed to create de-development and really destroy also the social fabrics of societies in order to eventually, achieve regime change for, anti-systemic states that oppose U.S. imperialism. So, that was, a big part of the sanctions regime against Russia. But, as we know, both the war itself and it's really, and I talk about it in the piece as well, how, I think I cite Pravat Petnaik to talk about the kind of ultimate futility of some of the desperate measures that have been implemented and, strategic failures in Ukraine, for example, where firstly, the U.S. military, it's really demonstrated the overextension of the U.S. military and how it's hamstrung by production shortages, which is, partially why we see with the recent NATO summit, the U.S. has pushed for the increase from 2% to 5% spending for European militaries of GDP for European militaries, which is to escalate military production and essentially pay for U.S. imperialist warfare. And, at the expense of Europe's own working and middle classes, right? Because European states in many ways are also still colonized since World War II by the U.S. So, the U.S. is losing militarily in that war, and the sanctions themselves have also backfired. Many people have talked about this too, including Pravat Petnaik. People like, Ben Norton has done a lot of really great work on this too, and many other scholars and journalists. But essentially pointing out how, what has happened is that the sanctions regime, the failures, the strategic failures in Ukraine, military failures have, really led to Russia to adapt its economy, also its arms industry, which has surged. Its military is now outproducing Europe in terms of artillery, shells, drones, tanks, vehicles. So Ukraine's failed counteroffensive in many ways exposed NATO's structural weaknesses, as well as, the production shortages and bottlenecks. And it's really driven Russia closer to states like China, Iran, developing military and economic pacts, and, has accelerated de-dollarization, also, de-risking strategies of global majority states, and developing an alternative architecture, financial and economic and military architecture to that which has been dominated by the U.S., the so-called rules-based order, for so many decades. So it's playing a really important role in that way in terms of the major transformations that are underway within the world system and the rise of a multipolar world order.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And we see I was going to say the logical conclusion, maybe it is, but also just the rules-based order is fully on display right now, with obviously the genocide in Gaza, the provocations, against Venezuela that are going on within the last few days, as well as even the denial of, the Palestinian Authority, which is a U.S.-backed and Israeli-backed really comprador kind of force in Palestine, as other countries are considering, maybe it is time for state recognition in the face of all of this, violence, even if a lot of them are doing it, I think, for quite cynical reasons to sort of save face within their own countries. But yeah, I mean, the sooner that the rules-based order can fall, the better. And it's certainly exposed itself for the farce that it is in the last couple of years, for sure.
Definitely. And also, just to add, sorry, Jared, I don't know if you've been following the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and, the discussions that have been happening around that meeting recently. And it's interesting also to see the sort of Western press, not just with the recent Chinese military parade, which I think created a lot of anxiety here in the capitalist core, but also this combined with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in China, in Tianjin, was pretty incredible, because what this signifies not only is a sort of growing security cooperation on the, Eurasian continent, which then also shows you that all these attempts through Ukraine and through, targeting of Russia to undermine and destabilize the region and create divisions have not worked, but actually have brought states closer together, including India, which, had for many years border tensions with China. And so, I think that, really what comes out of this meeting is, deepening cooperation between member states and, really creating the financial and economic infrastructure and security infrastructure to challenge Western imperialism. And I do think that this is creating a lot of anxiety here in the imperialist core. And so, some of the contradictions, some of Trump's sort of desperate maneuvers, whether it's including the, as you pointed out, sending 4,000 Marines and a nuclear submarine to Venezuela to threaten Venezuela, the tariff wars, all of this is really, it's not a sign of strength at all. It's a sign of desperation. It's a sign of desperation. And, of course, we know, as Gramsci said, the dying order, I'm going to misparaphrase it or not as eloquently as he put it, but, that it comes with a lot of violence, right? Before the New World Order is born. And, this is the time of monsters. So that's not to belittle or to undermine the violence that that we are experiencing, and the world has been experiencing, and it's going to accelerate in different ways. But what this makes me hopeful about is that the end is near. For the rest of the world to live, for liberation to be possible here in the core, and in the belly of the beast, and globally, U.S. empire needs to fall. And this is what is happening. And so these are all examples of how it's happening. And, there will be contradictions in each step of the way. There will be. It's not going to be perfect. It will not be pure. It will not be. And so any Western Marxist looking for that kind of purity, those are the fair weather friends. If you can't come out and defend Maduro, when there's a $50 million bounty on his head and threatening the Bolivarian, socialist revolution, which is, the left needs to defend, just like we need to defend the Cuban Revolution. We need to defend Nicaragua and the Sandinista revolution. If we don't defend these revolutions, we have no models for the future. We have nothing to build on, and we have no resistance. But, that being said, I am so hopeful right now. I am hopeful that the end is near and that liberation is on the horizon.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, thank you. So, you kind of, I think, got into some of this next question that I wanted to ask you, but there's probably some other elements that you can bring in from your piece, which is, talking about kind of an assessment of this move towards multipolarity at this time. On the one hand, we can see all of these kind of symptoms of US-led imperial decline. We've kind of talked about quite a few of those. And, in your piece, you talk about Paris Yaros's analysis that decline and the anxiety in the West that the, quote, global majority is catching up may enable these states to break free from the imperialist-dominated world law of value and instead pursue auto-centered, sovereign, and popular development, end quote. And so, on the one hand, of course, we can see these trends if we look for them. And on the other hand, I think many, and this kind of gets a little bit to, our Western Marxists' imaginations a little bit, but, it is frustrating, I think, a lot of times for people, too, that as you see something like the genocide in Gaza, right? And this full kind of ethnic cleansing campaign that's going on right now, that there are so few kind of resistance forces that are joining, along with the Palestinian resistance, of course. We can talk about Yemen. We can talk also about Yemen's prime minister and cabinet ministers being assassinated just a few days ago as we're having this discussion. And you can talk about Iran, right? And Iran also facing significant consequences and kind of decapitation of a lot of its, military leadership and, things like this, as well as government officials, right? In their brief, war that Israel and the United States really enacted and sponsored around this kind of ruse of denuclearizing or whatever they want us to believe was the kind of aim of that. There's Lebanon, right? We can talk about these things and, but I think many people, you hear the calls, right, of like other progressive and anti-imperialist forces, becoming more involved in the fight, right? And not seeing that happen. And so I'm sure you encounter these feelings a lot from people too, as you're kind of have the kind of analysis that you have too, and you're working within Palestinian solidarity spaces and things like that. in terms of people thinking about, kind of the state of multipolarity, I see people saying, well, why doesn't China get more directly involved? Now, I know that China has its own kind of foreign policy doctrine, right, which is non-interventionist and all of these kinds of things. But these are questions that people raise of, okay, well, why isn't there a stronger boycott being pushed by a lot of these states to the Zionist entity, these kind of things. And so I guess that's what the question is around, is sort of how do you respond to folks who are like, yeah, it's great that the US empire is falling, but I'm not seeing the kind of progressive socialist trajectory that I would love to see from some of these other powerful forces within the kind of multipolar world.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Definitely one that a lot of people are asking. I think one thing that always guides my response is thinking about the Palestinian resistance, the importance of, and the axis of resistance in general, the importance of strategic patience. Not everything happens overnight. All of our historical revolutions. I also look at, the Algerian Revolution. Many people have probably, your viewers have seen the Battle of Algiers, which is about an important battle that took place in 1954. Algerian liberation didn't come until 1962. And, over 1 million Algerians were killed in that particular, span of the battle. But of course, if we're going back to the 1800s, when Algeria was first colonized, we're talking about millions of, people killed, injured, displaced. So, that's not to also belittle, or minimize the sacrifices that are made by our martyrs. These are all of our martyrs for global liberation, because, we know that they're extensive, but they are also a feature of all of our liberation struggles, from Asia to Africa to Latin America, and going back, of course, to the Haitian Revolution. Revolutions don't happen overnight. It's not as easy as that. And I think, we need to also think about structural and systemic changes and how crucial they are to creating the space for national liberation struggles to be achieved. So people may say, oh, well, what's the importance of having the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS, or these alternatives to the IMF and World Bank, or alternative military cooperation agreements, as long as, Palestine, as long as the genocide is still happening in Palestine, as long as, as Haiti is still being occupied and people are still dying across Latin America and the African continent from structural adjustment and, the accumulation of waste, as Ali Qadri put it. Well, these are tectonic transformations underway, and, they will create opportunities, firstly, on a military level, the fact that you have superior military equipment now, that states like Iran, China, Russia are not just able to have control over, but are producing themselves, and how those weapons then get disseminated and implemented by national liberation struggles across the globe. The economic infrastructure to evade, imperialist economic warfare, so that states can develop in autonomous ways and develop food sovereignty, military sovereignty, economic and energy sovereignty. All the things that are required to achieve sustainable development that meets the needs and aspirations of the masses. So, socialist development is not possible without these tectonic transformations. It's a prerequisite, I believe Paris Yero says, in so many words in the piece that I cite him in. It's not the end in and of itself, multipolarity, or, polycentrism, as Samir Amin describes it, but it is a prerequisite for achieving socialist national liberation. And I think, people need to develop some of that strategic patience and learn from the historical struggles and sacrifices that have been made, as well as the contemporary. And that's sort of how I would respond to those folks.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. All right. So a couple more things. So one, Black August just ended, which of course, I didn't even know this was going to be the case when I wrote this question, but, you all have the Black August issue that just came out. And, I also said that Black August is not really over, in my opinion, because, the Attica anniversaries I really think about as a part of that. But you use George Jackson's notion of an international fascist counter-revolution in your piece as well. And so I wanted to talk a little bit, give you some space to talk a little bit about what you draw from George Jackson's analysis for today's conjuncture.
So George Jackson is really, and how I talk about him in this piece, citing Orasani Burton's amazing work as, the tip of the spear of revolutionary praxis, and also, of course, intellectual, revolutionary intellectual knowledge production. And I think his, one of the arguments I try to make here is that, I don't know if I do it successfully, that, that we need to center those people who have been at the forefront of these struggles in terms of how we understand these oppressive, exploitative structures and systems today, fascism, imperialism, capitalism, not just because, we want to uplift those who have made the most sacrifices, but most importantly, because, again, they're producing correct analysis because they are on the front lines. And that goes with individuals like George Jackson, as it goes with states, unlike Venezuela, which is not surprising. I say that they're also at the forefront of fighting global fascism today. And they had this global anti-fascism parliament that I discuss in the piece as well, referencing Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. So, I think with Jackson, everyone, many people have referenced his analysis in Blood in My Eye, thinking about fascism as a higher form of capitalism that, safeguards monopoly capital during crises, suppressing class struggle and revolutionary consciousness. He says, of course, to understand another point that he makes, and I also reference Nina Farnia's excellent work on this too, because she really got me to think in different ways about Aimé Césaire's point about the boomerang, of colonialism. He described in Discourses on Colonialism, he describes fascism in Europe as it emerges under Nazis in Germany and the Holocaust against Jewish people, that was the boomerang of colonialism and slavery returning to the metropole. So the violence enacted elsewhere then eventually comes home. And something that Nina wrote, and, another amazing scholar whose work everybody should be familiar with, is that the boomerang has always been here. That the fascism has always, it never left. The boomerang never left. The fascism has always been here. This is a settler colonial state built on slavery. And that's something that, of course, George Jackson said. He says, understand the reality of our situation. Understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will die or live poor, butchered half-lives if you fail to act. That just reminds us, especially, and I also bring in Gabriel Rockhill's work here too, to look at fascism as, the flip side of, the same capitalist coin. You have liberal governance, the nice cops when there's no crisis, when there's no economic crisis. But when I say that, you have liberalism, that doesn't mean, and this is where Jackson comes in, not for racialized, super exploited populations in this country. It's never been a liberal democratic state, for Black and brown and indigenous populations in this country, working class in particular. And, the prison system, of course, is a specific example of that, as is super exploitation of labor and other forms of political and economic repression. But for the white kind of middle class and upper class and even working class, because of the class compromise, that was made, and racial wage, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, that during times of crisis, though those policies and practices that are enacted on Black and brown communities, working class communities, get enacted on the rest of the population, on the white population as well. And that's where the bad cop comes in. But it's really important that we understand fascism as systemic, as not an aberration of capitalism, but as systemic and integral to capitalism. And therefore, we can't sort of fetishize Trump. And the liberals at this moment are having a field day because they get to sort of present themselves as the saviors of the moment and fighting fascism without, looking at the ways in which liberalism paves the way for fascism and indeed, works hand in hand in many ways with fascism. Now, an element of George Jackson's work that is often not recognized, even in critical approaches and people who do uplift his work, is his focus on international forms of fascism. And that's something that I wanted to bring out too. And he says in the book, one of the most definite characteristics of fascism is its international quality. And so here I kind of bring in the various dimensions of international fascism. And that includes the coups, attempted regime change in Venezuela, also what we've witnessed recently in Syria, which of course is the culmination. And here, please read Patrick Higgins, another AISC scholar who has written extensively on the backstory of Syria and the various imperialist interventions over decades that culminated with regime change most recently. And, the coming to power of HTS, a former supposed enemy that was actually funded and, supplied by the US. So the kind of regime change operations, various forms of hybrid warfare, including sanctions, the tariff wars, the trade wars, all of that is part of it. And this is really about, again, trying to stabilize capital accumulation in the core countries at a time when the system is being threatened severely by the rise of China, by the rise of the BRIC states, and the rise, in general, of a multipolar world order. And so, this is why fascism is required now, why the bad cop is required now, because the U.S. can't sustain war on multiple fronts. It needs to repress dissent at home so that it can continue carrying out these various forms of imperialist intervention abroad. And part of that here is the repression, but it's also the lawfare. It's the fear mongering. So, the ICE raids have resulted in mass deportations. But, that's also a systemic feature of the racist immigration system in this country. It's not something that just started under Trump. We all know Obama was the deporter in chief. Numbers have gone up, and the terrorizing of communities is what's most important here too. Sending in the brown shirts, of today. ICE are really the brown shirts of today, coming in masked, armed, terrorizing communities. That's also how you discipline society. That's how you try to scare people off from mobilizing and organizing, and doing that so that, the home front can be pacified while the imperialist interventions are escalating abroad. And we're certainly seeing that happen, not just in the form of the genocide, which is, the centerpiece of it all, but as you said, Venezuela, increasing interventions in Latin America, mobilizing military force around China, the Ukraine war, attempts to destabilize the Sahel alliance, another really important development in terms of the emergence of a multipolar world order and states that are sovereign, militarily sovereign, and therefore can be, achieve national liberation. So the connection between domestic fascism and international fascism is one that George Jackson made. And I think it's really crucial that we remember and honor his legacy, for all kinds of reasons, not just during Black August, but, throughout the year. And also because it's going to help us to understand the critical conjuncture that we're at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. George Jackson's one of my kind of go-to theorists, to be honest with you. But yeah, so we've talked about quite a bit of this as well, but there may be a couple other points that you want to raise regarding this. And, I've been thinking a lot sort of about what is the rights project currently in the US. And of course, there's certain templates that are out there. I mean, it's Project 2025. There's certain ways in which they just sort of tell us what their project is. But I think that there are some, there's some interesting contradictions in it, ways that it doesn't quite make a lot of sense to me, even as I try to put myself in, the shoes of fascists to sort of understand the way that they're thinking, right? And so there's a few that I just want to kind of run through here and see kind of if your thoughts on kind of linkages here or analysis of it. And so one is obviously there's a big kind of lean into austerity in a lot of sectors, both in like federal government departments, obviously also things like USAID, like kind of a pullback of soft power aspects, but also, things like the drain on academic research, right? The cutting off of so many federal grants and the kind of way that has, it's kind of interesting. You probably have thoughts on this as well, folks in universities. Like there's been austerity pushes in universities for many years now, and there's a lot of ways in which the kind of Zionist counterinsurgency stuff that we're seeing related to universities really dovetails with both kind of right-wing aims, governmental aims, and also a lot of times just the viewpoints of university administrators who have been looking for ways to cut back certain programs, even certain areas of study. And, so that's all going on one hand. You have also, as you've kind of just were talking about, increases in, ICE funding and putting a lot more money into building up a really large ICE, force in the Department of Homeland Security, and the kind of confrontations around deportation, this kind of, as you say, like really terrorizing communities through this. And then also very much connected, you have this kind of rhetoric around gangs, around narco trafficking, right? Which is we were just talking to Venezuela Analysis the other day, but the way that this is used on one level to sort of demonize someone like Nicolas Maduro, right, on one hand, but also to kind of render all of these immigrants in the United States even more deportable, trying to connect it with ideas of invasion and also like terrorism, right, through these kind of ways of sort of even escalating the removal processes, sending people to Seacoast, right, in El Salvador. And obviously Haiti in particular has faced a lot of the demonization around gangs, as you point out in your piece. And you also talk about Jemima Pierre's work. So there's all of that, right? And there's kind of the sort of weird aspects too around, there's a lot of people are losing their jobs in this, time period. And then part of what the right is saying is like, oh, well, we're removing all of these undocumented people so that the people that are losing jobs can go to those jobs, right? And, and then of course there's the deployment of the National Guard in DC. And I think I saw the other day, maybe yesterday, that they're talking about, they've been talking about Baltimore, but it seems like that's what they're going to try, one of the places they're going to try to go next. And so, obviously this is not a future or a present that is livable, right? Or that we would want to live in. But it's also kind of interesting to me in kind of just always trying to do this intellectual project of saying, well, what are they actually trying to do with all of these things, right? There's some of it we could say, well, it's just sort of red meat to the base of these long kind of racializing projects that have been going on for decades. And so they're sort of giving the people what they want in terms of a sort of kind of fascist settler kind of base for this stuff. But that doesn't really do it for me. And I don't think it probably does for you either in terms of an analysis, if we're really thinking about a capitalist system and how it imagines itself functioning in a kind of declining imperial project. And so I'm just kind of curious in any thoughts that you have on that thing. I know I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you, but,
A lot of good stuff. Yeah, that was excellent. Yeah, a lot of food for thought. Thanks. And totally, I think it's a really important, really, really important question. And I'm glad that you raised austerity too, because austerity seems to be a central aim of all of this. And when we think even about the attacks on the universities and the defunding, the billions of defunding, and even Colombia, which capitulated to everything, or I don't even think we should use the word anymore of complicity or capitulating. They're colluding, right, with the fascist ruling class. And, they still got hit, with this austerity. these austerity measures. So in many ways, Zionism, of fascism in general, and Zionism, again, as the kind of ideological architecture here, is being used to justify extreme forms of austerity. And because, of course, we live in a capitalist racist system, austerity is always racialized as well in terms of who gets hit the hardest. And class, right? Because it's going to be, what's happening is that there needs to be a reduction in the social wage in order for the ruling class to continue accumulating to the extent that they have, become accustomed to. And, they're not going to raise taxes on the wealthy, of course, and they're not going to force the wealthy to make any kinds of economic sacrifices. So it's either through, imperialist interventions in order to continue the wealth drain from the global majority. And when that hits a wall, it's self-cannibalizing. So then you have to start extracting surplus from your own population. And, that's what's happening in Europe, because it's the European sort of working class and middle class who are going to pay for this burgeoning, military industrial complex with the 5% spending on arms industry, on building up military capacity and arms production. And here as well, it's going to be on the working class, and largely Black and brown and indigenous working class, who are going to pay for this. And the level of universities, for example, as you pointed out, if we think about austerity, this is being done in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. Right. So again, making that the false equation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and saying, oh, well, the problem is we have all of these, anti-Semitic students and workers in our universities. So we need to make these cuts and cut actually people, fire them, suspend, but also make cuts to those institutions that aren't disciplining their students and faculty and staff enough, and, do it in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. But in fact, what's happening is an extreme austerity that has been the aim of the neoliberal state for decades, and especially gutting, public institutions. So, in the piece, for example, I also talk about Clara Matte's book, in which she talks about post-World War I Italy, and talks about the extreme austerity that was implemented by a liberal government as being the handmaiden of fascism. For example, she says how in the early 1920s, Mussolini slashing wages by decree and crushed labor unions, increased the rate of exploitation, unemployment soared from 2% to 11.3%, which contributed to the expanding reserve army of labor, while corporate profits more than tripled. And I think that's what we're seeing here, is that in one of the ways, and Prabhat Patnaik talks about this a lot, especially in regards to the global South, that surplus value is extracted and capital is accumulated is through the reserve army of labor. So the more people who are unemployed or underemployed or working at informal employment, the easier it is to discipline labor. And that also intersects with Ali Qadri's analysis, because wars do something similar. They also expand the global reserve army of labor and make it easier to discipline labor, because people become so vulnerable and just need to work. So I think that's a really crucial element of it. And, you also brought in some of the discursive dimensions of the current manifestations of fascism, the narco-terrorism, for example, which is being leveled against Venezuela, which is ridiculous. The biggest narco-traficantes are the Americans, right? The gringos, the DEA. We all know that. This is just a load of BS designed to justify intervention. In the same way, the war on terror has been mobilized in that way to justify intervention, knowing that the U.S. is the greatest purveyor of terrorism, the U.S. and its Zionist appendage globally. And gangs is another discourse that's used in the case of Haiti to also normalize intervention, as Jemima Pierre, another brilliant scholar who needs to be on everyone's radar, I'm sure already is, who says, Haiti doesn't have a gang problem. It has a U.S. imperialism problem. And I think that's really a crucial analysis. So yeah, again, I think it's always important to think about the connections between the war at home and here thinking about fascism and the relationship with extreme austerity and the major cuts that are being made as a form of class warfare on the working class here, to food stamps, to housing subsidies, to Medicaid and Medicare. These are all going to have a huge impact moving forward. And, of course, Trump is claiming that there's going to be this industrial development that, as you were saying, these new jobs are going to be produced. Most economists, I was just listening to Michael Hudson, there's so many critical economists out there who say, this is, and Prabhat Patnaik's piece I cite as well says that, basically this is a pipe dream. This isn't going to happen. So what are we going to see? More accumulation of waste, more genocide. That's what's scary, is what is going to happen to our surplus populations globally, because we are part of, a global, I understand myself, and I'm sure you do too, as part of this global majority. And that is terrifying. But, as you know, and you've had many people on here making this argument, people are fighting back, and not just globally. The global majority, that's the tip of the spear. That's where the revolution is happening. But here, there is growing resistance too. And I was so inspired by what I saw in LA and the fight back against the fascist ICE raids. People are really organized. And, in New York also, I think there's a lot that happened, important organizing that came out of the Palestine solidarity movement that's there, that comes out of historical Black and, Puerto Rican liberation struggles and indigenous struggles here. We're building on all of those historical legacies and the infrastructure that's been put in place and the organizing ecosystems. And I'm hopeful that this is a turning moment, that this is a potentially revolutionary context, even in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great point to kind of wrap up on or wind down on. But is there anything else that you wanted to kind of share or say as we prepare to close out?
Yes, actually, I'd just like to uplift some of the organizing work, especially at CUNY, where, it's still my community. They're trying to get rid of me, but I haven't left yet, and I'm going to fight to stay. And even if I'm not employed, I will always be part of that CUNY community. And I do, want to uplift. I know you mentioned the statement that is now on the AISC website, which is great, and I hope people can sign. There's also an action letter for the Fired Four. That's what we're calling ourselves, including the other three adjuncts that the PSC, our union CUNY, put out, which I'll share. And there's an action letter also for Hadika Arzu Malik, who's a CUNY student, who's one of 8 who have been suspended. And she has now been banned from all 25 CUNY campuses. She's suspended for a year, for standing in solidarity with Palestinian liberation and fighting racist police violence. And so I'm going to share that as well. The last point I'd like to make is I've been also part of some formations, anti-repression formations, which are thinking about ways that we can do defense work that really centers the politics of what people are being repressed and retaliated against for. Because there is a tendency in some of, our movement spaces to and it comes from a good place, to try to maybe water down, make people more appealing, find common denominators so that people will support defense campaigns. And, I think that does a disservice to the movement and to the individuals who have taken risks to fight in these struggles. So one organization I'm part of, called the Sanctuary and Popular University Network, or SPUN, is trying to do just that, center Palestine liberation, supporting resistance against Zionist settler colonial genocide and imperialism, and making connections between fascism at home and global fascism, in the form of Zionist imperialist intervention, militarism, and genocide. And I think that's really the way forward. And especially because, again, my positionality as an academic in a university, that's where I'm focused on right now in terms of institutional spaces. Creating sanctuary and popular university is the way that we materially fight back against the role our institutions play in upholding and reinforcing these racist, violent, oppressive systems and structures. And we need to bring these struggles together. And part of that is also transforming these institutions, getting rid of unjust governance structures. We should not have board of trustees that represent ruling class interests, in a public institution like CUNY. Get rid of, abolish the board of trustees, have student, worker, and community governance of our institutions, and make them truly liberatory spaces.
Right on. No, I'm glad that you're engaged in that, and that sounds great. Thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful. It's been really good to connect with you and have this discussion today.
Same here. Thank you so much, Jared. And thanks again for all the work that you do.